at AUB. Very interesting times, from 73 to 79. And so to get the opportunity to come back to Lebanon, I really welcome the opportunity. The title I've been given is The Impact of the Changing Energy Landscape on the New Great Game of the Middle East. Now, let me say a little bit what I'm going to talk about here. I'm going to begin by saying, what is this shifting energy landscape? And to do that, I need to talk about the current energy transition. The current energy transition is a move away from hydrocarbon molecules towards electrons. And I have slightly maverick views on this because I think it's going to happen a lot faster than some people think. I'll come back to that point, obviously. Now, the key uncertainty about the energy transition is the speed of the transition, and there are differing views on this. I'll then look at the impact on the new great game of the Middle East. I'm afraid I hate that title. For those of you with a sense of history, you will know the Great Game was referred to as the battle between the British Empire and the Russian Empire for control of Central Asia. And frankly, the last thing this region needs is more outside interference in what's going on. The only good thing that came out of that, I think, was an Arab joke which said, why did God give the British an empire upon which the sun never sets? Because he didn't trust the British in the dark, which was probably very wise of him in the circumstances. I want to look a little bit, so what are the impact of this transition on energy geopolitics? And to do that, I've got to say, well, what was the old geopolitics of energy, which dominated the 20th century? And then I'll look at the new geopolitics, and it's a two-stage process. What happens during the transition, and then when the transition is over, what happens afterwards? So let me start talking a bit about the current energy transition. As I say, moving from hydrocarbons to electrons. Now, there's a lot of history of energy transitions. There's been a lot of them. I have to say my favorite one was the United States between 1860 and 1900. In 1860, the US consumed 80% wood, 20% coal. By 1900, it was 80% coal, 20% wood. And the reason I love that example is because if you go back and read the contemporary literature, the newspaper articles, the journal articles, it's all about the impending energy crisis. For those of you who remember the nonsense of peak oil in the 1990s, it caused me huge amusement to see exactly the same language being used in the 1860s. We're running out of wood, it's the end of life as we know it. Now, if you look at that history of the different transitions, you can see a process emerging. First of all, a trigger is pulled. Once that trigger is pulled, then you begin to see reinforcing factors, usually associated around technical change, which changes relative energy prices. Now, as I say, the current transition is from hydrocarbon molecules to electrons, and the triggers have been environmental. Initially, concern about climate change and the need to have lower carbon emissions. But more recently, and I say more recently in the last 10 years or so, especially in Asia, issues to do with urban air quality are becoming at least, if not more important, which proves the old adage that all politics is local. You don't need a panel of eminent international scientists to tell you it's bad for you. Just try walking down the street, or better still, get your kids to walk down the street, and you'll suddenly realize this is a bit of a problem. Now, the reinforcing factors in this transition are numerous. First of all, the falling cost of renewables, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Secondly, the penetration of electric vehicles. Thirdly, there are other demand-side factors associated with the so-called fourth industrial revolution. And finally, and I should warn you here that I am a well-known pessimist. For Winnie the Pooh fans, my colleagues refer to me as Eeyore on speed. So I'll be careful in terms of what I'm saying here. But I am very pessimistic about the state of the region. I can't help feeling that within a couple of years there is going to be some sort of a shooting war, even if it happens by accident, and that this will certainly lead to an oil price shock and there are few advantages to getting old, but one of them is you can say, yes, I remember that, I was there. And I remember the impact of the oil shock of the 1970s and the way it influenced the energy policy of OECD governments. I can see the same sort of thing happening again. Now, as I've said, the key uncertainty about this is the speed of the transition. And there are very contrasting views. On the one hand, what I call the energy establishment, the IEA, OPEC Secretariat, the EIA in the United States, and a lot of the big oil companies, at least in public, are all sort of underestimating the speed of this transition. And you can see that in the way they're constantly having to revise their estimates of renewable penetration into the market. Why are they doing that? I suspect there's a lot of vested interest in there. It's difficult for the chief economist of any oil company to write a letter to the shareholder saying, dear shareholder, it's been nice knowing you, but the good days are over, times are changing. The other extreme is the financial community, the banks, the insurance companies, particularly the insurance companies. And it seems to me they're much more realistic, and you only have to look at the whole divest campaign to see the truth of that. So, as I say, there are extremes of the speed of transition. I favour very much the faster transition. Now, why does the speed of the transition matter? It matters because the transition is going to be a disruption. And the faster that disruption happens, the bigger the disruption it's going to be. As hydrocarbon demand falls, exporters are not likely to adjust to this. If you look at the hydrocarbon-dependent economies, their record on diversification, for the most part, has been absolutely abysmal. There are 16 major hydrocarbon exporting countries in the world. 8 of them are from the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa. They account for 56% of global oil exports. Only 4 of those 16 are classed as politically stable in one of these league tables. I'm dubious of these league tables. The UN came up with one that said that UK was the 9th happiest country in the world. I think they must have done that survey in June 1966 when we won the World Cup, because it's been downhill ever since, to be perfectly honest. But nonetheless, the countries that are most dependent on hydrocarbon exports are often the most politically unstable, which does not bode well for them trying to actually adjust. So, what's the geopolitical impact of all this? To understand that, we have to go back to the old geopolitics of energy, which dominated the 20th century, and arose because of the uneven distribution of hydrocarbon resources and reserves. So for oil, for example, 56% of reserves are in the MENA region. For gas, 70% of the region are in MENA and what used to be, what still is, the CIS. Even coal, 75% of the reserves are only in 5 countries. The result of this is you begin to see competition and conflict. The best example I can think of here was in 1914. The Royal Navy, the British Navy, switched from coal to oil for very sensible reasons to do with the accuracy of naval gunnery, etc. The problem was that while Britain had plenty of coal, it didn't have any oil. So you can make an argument that from about 1914 onwards, British foreign policy was dominated by the need to get access to oil, if only to sort of fuel the Royal Navy. And you can make a good case for that. Other things are going on as well, of course, but nonetheless, it is important. So what about the new geopolitics? The first stage is during the transition itself. The imperative for the oil and gas exporters is to diversify their economies. And as I say, there generally has been a failure to diversify. If you look at the data, a good measurement of diversification is the non-oil fiscal deficit. And you will see in most of the countries, particularly most of the Arab oil producers, that has actually been increasing rather than decreasing. In other words, diversification has been going backwards. Why? I could give you a 5-hour lecture on it, but I won't. But it's to do with the role of the private sector and the way in which the private sector gets stifled by the ruling elites in many of the countries we're talking about. The faster the transition is, the greater the disruption is going to be. And I have to say, and remember, I'm Eeyore on speed, I can see the region becoming highly destabilized in this process as the transition goes on. However, eventually at some point it's over and the transition is there, the sunlit uplands, if you like. What are the new geopolitics of energy looking like? Well, the key point here is that renewables are different from hydrocarbons. And they're different in this way. The projects can be small scale, decentralized, and everywhere. I am about to produce a Chatham House report. It's going through the Chatham House publication process, which makes the Inquisition look generous, I should add. The working title I had, which Chatham House won't allow me because they think it's too frivolous, is The Current Energy Transition and the Geopolitics of Carrots. Now, what's the point about the geopolitics of carrots? There aren't any. Everybody uses them, everybody can grow them. There's no sort of domination of supply. And in the same way, you can make an argument that says renewables also will have very little to do with geopolitics. There's going to be no domination of the resource potential. Now, of course, there are going to be other issues as well. For example, there is concern over access to certain key minerals to do with batteries, lithium and cobalt. I personally think those concerns are grossly overstated for a variety of reasons, and that technology will come along and find replacements for them. And in any case, lithium, people say, oh, it's a rare earth. Well, it's not a rare earth because it's rare. It's sort of later discovery in the periodic table. There's plenty of lithium all over the place. And as I speak now, all the big mining companies are going through their past records because they found bags of lithium 20, 30 years ago, but nobody had any use for it. So they're all going back now to see, well, let's get some lithium and see what we can do. There's also likely to be conflict over interconnectors. One of the problems with renewables, as I'm sure you're aware, is the issue of intermittency. Sometimes the sun doesn't shine, sometimes the wind doesn't blow, which means you need sort of backup. And this is going to lead to a very large increase in the number of interconnectors. Now, interconnectors are a bit like oil and gas pipelines. I've looked a lot at the history of oil and gas pipelines, particularly in this part of the world, and the record ain't very good, one has to say. They are subject to all sorts of problems. Also, as well, there could be issues over international patent rights, international property rights. Again, easily got over. A good example, excellent example, is Toyota. Announced last month that it was going to give up its IP protection on its hybrid technology, so anybody could use it. There's lots of options there to solve it. However, having said that, I think the old geopolitics of energy surrounding conflict over access will be gone. If you can get through stage one, of course. This is the problem. Can you get through that period of instability in the existing oil producers? This is hardly the great game. And as I say, for that, it's potentially good news, because the last thing this part of the world needs is to have other people from outside the region coming in and interfering. So on that slightly more optimistic note, thank you very much for your attention.